man has always been curious about the creation of society and creation of a state as well. And at least three philosophers came up with the social contract theories. One of them was Thomas Hobbes. But before we understand the ideas of Thomas Hobbes, it's important to understand the circumstances, the time that he was living in. He had very long age, living over 80 years. He was very closely associated with the ruling elite of the time. And in the 16th century and the early 17th century, when he was there in his country, he could witness across Europe there was a sort of tussle between the clergy and the monarchs. And he definitely supported monarchs. He wanted dictatorship to some extent. And he seemed to witness anarchy everywhere in Europe. There used to be feudal lords who might have had tiny feudal states ruling over it. Then there was this clergy that was not ready to give up its powers, that wanted to interfere with the affairs of a state. And then there were autocratic monarchs who also loved powers and did not like the interference of the clergy. So these were the circumstances. He was sort of in a situation which appeared to be anarchy. So that's why the type of life that he visualized or that he imagined in jungle was very close to anarchy. So Thomas Hobbes believed that in the life of jungle, the life was, as his famous sentence, brutish, and everyone was killing everyone, and there was no peace at all. When people were tired up of this prolonged bloodshed, they finally decided to hand over all powers into the hand of a person with the task that he would look after their security and he would enjoy impunity. Impunity in a sense that all the powers would be concentrated into his hand. If we observe this philosophy, it leads us towards absolutism. And a number of countries across the European continent witness absolute monarchy in several parts of Europe, including England, where Thomas Hobbes was born and where he, studied, and where he was also close to the ruling elite. And there are some historians who believe that he wanted to appease some princes or some members of the ruling elite, or that's why he had written that book. So this idea, political idea of Thomas Hobbes, is very close to dictatorship. And in reality, he wanted dictatorship. There are historians and political scientists who argue that no, he did not want all powers into the hands of the monarchs, but he only wanted monarchs to look after security, and rest of the things should be in the hands of people. For instance, what type of religion they want to follow, what type of ideas they want to have, that should have nothing to do with the king or the government in a broader sense. During the time of Thomas Hobbes, as I have told you, that there was a sort of tension between the kings and the clergy and the feudal elite. So it was an anarchic situation, and that situation can be seen in the writing of Thomas Hobbes as well. By the time John Locke started writing, and by the time he got prominence, we can see the powers of the rising bourgeoisie class or capitalist class. John Locke himself was from a wealthy class, from a business class. He was comparatively rich, and he also had stakes in London Stock Exchange. So he denied the theory he denied the assertion that in the life of jungle everybody was fighting everyone and there was no security. He said no, that was not the case. Man was happy in jungle as well, but he wanted to maximize his pleasure. He was living alone. For instance, if somebody, let's say, growing mango, he can only enjoy mango because he is living alone. If he wants to, let's say, eat apples, he can't have done it because he is living alone. So people decided to maximize their pleasure, to maximize their joy, and in order to do that, they establish an exchange system. So if somebody who was growing apples and he wanted to eat, let's say, mangoes, he could not have done that until and unless he established a society. So this is how people established a society. And after the establishment of society, if somebody wanted to eat mangoes or apples or anything else, they can do it. They could exchange those goods, agriculture goods. And in order to supervise that exchange, they appointed some people who were from them, who were from their community, with the task that you would justly supervise this exchange system. And if you do not do so, then we would depose you. We would bring other people. Now this idea is very close to democracy. And if we closely observe 18th century, the rising bourgeoisie class or the capitalist class, it had started exerting influence. It was getting power in House of Commons to some extent as well. Its wealth was increasing. So it was giving tough time to feudal elite. It was also giving tough time to the clergy. So this reflects the rising power of the bourgeoisie class or the capitalist class. And this concept is very close to democracy. In democracy, you elect people. If they do what you want them to do, they would remain in power. If they do not perform well, if they do not serve people, they would be voted out. By the time in 18th century, late 18th century, the ugliness of capitalism had started revealing itself. There was pollution everywhere, agriculture destruction, there were slums, in major urban centers, and that prompted Shelley and one of the poets that hell is a place much like London. And William Wordsworth wrote about the beauty of London, but at the time when there is no smoke of the factories, when it is serene and calm. Rousseau came up with a very different idea of social contract. He in fact lamented that man created society. He was against society, and he romanticized savages, or romanticized the people who lived in jungle. He believed that man was only free in the life of jungle because he was alone. There was no feudal lord, there was no peasant, there was no lord, there was no slave, there was no capitalist, there was no workers. Man was not responsible to anyone. He was not subordinate to anyone. He was on his own. He was the master of his own fate. If he felt sleepy, he might sleep under a tree. If he felt hungry, he might eat any fruits that he wanted. If he wanted to shout, he could have done that. If he wanted to dance, he could have done that. Naturally, if you dance now or shout now, your neighbor would give a call to police and they would come and arrest you. So he bemoaned the fact that man established society, and he thought that the moment he established society, he dug his own grave. He put a restraint on his freedom by establishing society. So he believed that man was free in absolute sense in jungle's life. The only curbs on man's freedom were natural laws, and natural laws would guide him. If he felt cold, he might lit fire, or he might hide himself here and there. If it was raining, he might have hidden here and there, covering himself. So only natural laws would regulate him. There was no state authority. There was no feudal lord. There was no tribal lord. There was no capitalist. There was no, bourgeoisie class or the government or the police or judiciary. So he was on his own. And then he said that in the life of jungle, man was free. This was not the case that all people handed over their powers to one man. And this was not the case either that all the men handed over powers to a few. What rather happened is that one individual said to another individual that you are my ruler and I'm your ruler. It means no one is ruler and no one is ruled. It means masses are the masters of their fate. Masses would decide whatever they want. This is what he called general will, that what the majority of the people or what the people believe, that should happen in reality. So these are the basic, and by the time Rousseau became prominent in France and across Europe, there were resistant movements all across Europe challenging capitalism. There were people who were demanding more rights for workers, for peasants, for downtrodden, for other classes of marginalized section. And in a way, Rousseau political thoughts reflect a bit revolutionary fervor as well. That people are what is the slogan of, like in our country, the slogan of People's Party to some extent, but that is just a slogan. That it's the people who decide everything. So the idea that people are the master of their own fate, they are the master of their own future. In fact, it in a way it empowered a common man, and Rousseau ideas, according to some critics, created revolutionary fervor that swept across the Europe in 18th century and parts of 19th centuries as well. So these are the three main social contract theories. The one was presented by Thomas Hobbes, the second by John Locke. Two of them were English, Rousseau was French, and the third one was presented by Rousseau.